Imagine sitting in on a Wall Street earnings call and hearing a bank executive calmly explain that his team has already war-gamed a politician's campaign promise, months before that promise ever became law. That's not a hypothetical. That's exactly what happened in New York City this year. Today we're diving deep into how Mayor Zohran Mamdani's rent freeze pledge went from a slogan on a bumper sticker to official city policy. And more importantly, what the banks, the courtrooms, and the city's own buried data reveal about what's actually happening behind the headlines. This is a story with a courtroom, a boardroom, and a spreadsheet. And by the time we're done, you'll understand a number that City Hall probably hopes you never find. If you're new to this channel, now's the perfect time to hit subscribe, because we're about to go a lot deeper than the news coverage ever did. Let's start at the beginning. On the morning of April 24th, on a live earnings call streamed straight to Wall Street, the chief financial officer of Flagstar Bank found himself answering a question that had nothing to do with typical banking metrics and everything to do with New York City politics. Now, Flagstar isn't some small regional lender nobody's heard of. It's long been one of the largest banks behind this city's apartment buildings, with billions of dollars riding directly on the exact rent-stabilized housing stock that Zohran Mamdani built his entire campaign around. An analyst on that call asked the only question that actually mattered in the room. What happens to all of that exposure if the mayor really does freeze the rent the way he promised? The CFO, a man named Lee Smith, didn't dodge the question, didn't deflect, didn't give a vague non-answer the way executives so often do. He said plainly that the bank had already modeled it out in detail. A 3-year rent freeze starting October 1st, with expenses climbing 2.75% every single year. And then he read out, line by line, what that scenario does to the buildings that lean hardest on regulated rents. And here's the thing about that room. Nobody gasped. Nobody reacted with shock. Rooms full of analysts and bankers rarely do, because to them, this was just numbers on a spreadsheet. But 62 days later, in an auditorium in East Harlem, a board handpicked entirely by the mayor voted to turn that bank's stress test, that cold hypothetical modeled months in advance, into actual binding city policy. Look, I was born in this city, I'm raising 2 kids here, and I have never in my life watched a bank prepare for a campaign slogan the way you'd prepare for an incoming hurricane. Full contingency planning, stress testing, worst-case modeling, all built around 3 words a politician said on the campaign trail. To really understand why that happened, we have to rewind the clock all the way back to a Tuesday night in late June of last year. And somewhere buried in this story is one number that simply does not add up. It is not the number you're expecting. And I genuinely don't think City Hall wants you to find it. So let's go back. 11 months before that fateful earnings call, Zohran Mamdani was just a state assemblyman from Astoria, someone most people in this city couldn't have picked out of a lineup if their life depended on it. He wasn't a household name. He wasn't a frontrunner. Then came the Democratic primary, and Andrew Cuomo, a former governor with the entire party machine, the donor class, and decades of political infrastructure behind him, lost to a 34-year-old Democratic socialist whose entire platform fit neatly on a bumper sticker. Freeze the rent. That was it. That was the whole pitch, repeated everywhere. He said it in television ads. He said it standing outside subway stops in the freezing cold. He said it in every single stump speech from Astoria to the Bronx. He promised, explicitly and repeatedly, to freeze rent every single year he holds office, across roughly 1 million rent-stabilized apartments, housing close to 2 million New Yorkers. That's not a niche policy position. That's nearly a quarter of the city's population directly affected by one campaign promise. In November, he won. And the very next morning, the major New York real estate names on the stock market slid noticeably. And Flagstar, the lender carrying billions of dollars in exposure to stabilized buildings, dipped right along with them. So did Wall Street take this campaign promise seriously? You don't need a quote from an analyst to answer that. The sell-off itself answered the question. On January 1st, Mamdani took office, and on day 1, he declared that stabilized tenants were in, and I'm quoting him directly here, dire need of relief. Now, here's an important detail a lot of coverage glossed over. The mayor doesn't actually freeze rents personally. That power belongs to a 9-member rent guidelines board, and it's the mayor who appoints those members. On his way out the door, outgoing Mayor Eric Adams tried to stack that board with appointees who would box Mamdani in, prevent him from delivering on his signature promise. It was, frankly, the political equivalent of a roommate moving out and taking every single light bulb in the apartment with them on the way out. If this kind of political maneuvering is the kind of story you want more of, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's a lot more digging ahead. On Flagstar's January earnings call, the CEO, Joseph Addington, told investors that Adams' last-minute maneuver had given the bank a window, a brief opportunity, to work out troubled loans before any freeze could take effect. But then he admitted something far more revealing. His team was already running the numbers, and I'm quoting him directly again, as if those rents were flat for 2 or 3 years, with expenses still climbing. Think about that phrase for a second. Banks do not build detailed financial models like that for fun. They don't spend analyst hours running hypothetical stress tests on a whim. They build those models because they genuinely believe there's a real chance it happens. That window Addington described slammed shut fast. Adams's attempt to stack the board didn't hold up, and by February, Mamdani had already seated 6 of the board's 9 members, including installing a brand new chair, Chantel McMillan. At that point, the board was unquestionably his, and buried inside the city's own numbers the city itself published, sits one single line that quietly undercuts the celebration you're going to hear about later in this video. Hold on to that thought because we're coming back to it. While City Hall was busy setting its political stage, something far uglier was already unfolding out in the buildings themselves, the actual physical properties this entire fight was supposed to be about. Just 2 weeks into the new administration, inside a Manhattan bankruptcy courtroom, the mayor got his very first real-world lesson in exactly how deep the financial trouble already ran. A portfolio of rent-stabilized buildings owned by the Pinnacle Group, a landlord whose code violations the mayor's own administration had specifically cited, had gone bust entirely and was now being sold off in bankruptcy court. Mamdani's administration formally objected to the sale, and in mid-January, the judge approved it anyway, overruling the mayor's objections, selling the portfolio to a bidder that was financed by Pinnacle's own original lender. Let that sink in for a second. The deal wiped out roughly $275 million of debt in a single transaction. And the lender's attorneys, in the middle of the hearing, committed an additional $3 million credit line just to reassure the judge that there would be enough cash on hand for basic repairs. Read that again. These buildings were worth so much less than the loans sitting on top of them that $250 million evaporated in one single room, with the mayor's own lawyers sitting there watching it happen in real time. So how deep does this rot actually go? It goes deeper than just one bankruptcy case. Researchers at Columbia Business School found that in the Bronx specifically, the average sale price of stabilized buildings had fallen to roughly the same level as the debt owed on them, which means many of these buildings now carry zero equity, or in some cases, less than zero. After Mamdani's election win, the New York Post reported that stabilized landlords were rushing to sell off properties at fire sale prices just to get out. And Sergey Brin reportedly dumped his entire stake in a New York real estate fund for a fraction of what it used to be worth. And the most damning voice in this entire story, the one testimony that cuts deepest, still hasn't even spoken yet. It isn't a banker, it isn't a landlord, and it certainly isn't a Republican. While all of this was unfolding in courtrooms and fire sales, the biggest lender in the entire game was already quietly heading for the exits. Since the end of 2023, Flagstar has cut its commercial real estate loan book by a staggering $13.4 billion, a 28% retreat, including $1.5 billion in apartment loans shed in the fourth quarter alone. This year, 42% of the loans getting paid off at full value were rated substandard by the bank's own internal metrics. So follow this trail with me. Pennies on the dollar, zero equity, $250 million erased in a single courtroom, and all of this happened before a single rent had even been frozen yet. And the scariest spreadsheet in this entire story hadn't even been read out loud yet. By the time analysts logged onto Flagstar's first quarter earnings call on April 24th, the bank was completely done dealing in hypotheticals. CFO Lee Smith walked Wall Street through the exact New York City buildings where at least half the units are rent regulated, an $8.8 billion slice of the bank's total loan book. Occupancy in these buildings sat at 97%, essentially full. And yet, barely half of those loans, just 52%, were rated healthy by the bank's own standards. The rest were labeled criticized or classified, which is the banking industry's polite corporate way of saying trouble is brewing. And $1.9 billion of that exposure wasn't paying at all anymore, already written down to appraisal levels. Sit with that for a second. The apartments are full. The tenants are paying their rent every month like clockwork. And the buildings are failing anyway, because regulated rents no longer come close to covering what it actually costs to run these buildings and service the debt sitting on top of them. Before we go further into the freeze itself, if you're finding this level of detail valuable, this is exactly the kind of deep dive content this channel is built around. So take a second and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Then came the freeze question, and the answer that this entire video is built around. The bank modeled a 3-year freeze starting this October 1st, with expenses rising 2.75% every year. Buildings that were 70% regulated or less showed essentially no meaningful damage in the model. But buildings above that 70% threshold, which represent the most affordable housing this city has left, those buildings lose 7 to 8% of their net operating income over just 3 years. And there's a wall coming that makes all of this even worse. 2027 is Flagstar's single biggest reset year, with nearly $9 billion in loans repricing all at once, $2.9 billion of that tied directly to rent-regulated buildings. Run this math alongside me for a second. A building that's already sitting right at break-even loses 7% of its income at the exact same moment its loan reprices to a higher rate. So what's actually left over to fix the boiler when it breaks? 62 days later, that model stopped being a hypothetical entirely. On June 25th, at El Museo del Barrio in East Harlem, Mamdani's Rent Guidelines Board voted 7-1 to freeze rents on both 1-year and 2-year leases simultaneously, the first double freeze in the board's entire history. The crowd in that room absolutely roared. Pizza boxes came out. "We Are the Champions" played over the speakers. Mamdani himself called it a historic victory for New York City tenants. Kenny Burgos of the New York Apartment Association fired right back, saying the freeze would, quote, destroy the living conditions for hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers. I did the actual math on this myself. The median stabilized rent in this city is about $1,500 a month, which means this freeze saves that household roughly $540 over the entire first year. Break that down, and it comes out to about $45 a month. In my house, that's one single week of groceries traded for absolutely everything you've just heard in this video. But here's the part that almost nobody talked about. The sharpest, most damning warning in this entire story didn't come from a banker in a suit or a real estate lobbyist with an agenda. It came from inside the board itself, from someone the mayor never even picked. Just hours before the freeze vote happened, one of the board's own sitting members walked out and detonated a bombshell on her way. Christina Smith, originally appointed by Eric Adams, resigned on the spot and published an open letter stating that the board had been deliberately rebuilt into a body that was, and this is her exact word, required to deliver a rent freeze. Not persuaded, not convinced by the evidence, required. She wrote explicitly that the board had stopped functioning as a legitimate fact-finding panel altogether. That is the equivalent of someone dropping the whistle in the middle of the game and telling the entire crowd that the final score was actually decided back in the locker room before the game even started. Then there's the one member who actually stayed until the very end. Arpit Gupta, a finance professor at NYU's business school, appointed originally by Democrat Eric Adams, cast the board's lone dissenting vote. And his case against the freeze is built entirely on math, not politics. During his time on the board, he says rent adjustments had already consistently been set below the board's own internal cost estimates, below inflation, and below city wage growth for years. The freeze doesn't create a new problem. It simply tightens a vice that was already closing. His forecast was blunt. Quote, "It's a little bit of a slow burn. Deferred maintenance shows up first. Deeper distress follows right behind it." And then there's the question almost nobody in that celebrating crowd wanted to ask out loud. Who actually benefits from this freeze? About 30% of stabilized tenants in this city earn six-figure incomes. A household pulling in $200,000 a year gets the exact same freeze, the exact same benefit, as a household earning just $30,000 a year. While the poorest renters stuck in market rate units, the ones with the least protection of all, get absolutely nothing but deeper and deeper scarcity. Gupta asked his fellow board members one simple, pointed question during deliberations. Under what conditions would this board ever approve a rent increase again? The record shows no one had an answer. Chair McMillan acknowledged that taxes and insurance costs were soaring, then simply said that most owners could absorb it. Meanwhile, nonprofit affordable housing operators testified under oath that their own insurance renewals had jumped anywhere from 25% all the way up to more than 200% in a single year. A courtroom, a spreadsheet, a boardroom. 3 separate rooms, 1 consistent warning, and 1 collective shrug from the people with the power to act on it. If you actually live in this city, you probably already know exactly how this story ends. And here's the part that really drives it home. The mayor's own former apartment ran this exact experiment in real time. When Mamdani left his rent-stabilized one-bedroom in Astoria to move into Gracie Mansion, his old landlord raced through renovations specifically designed to legally push the rent from $2,300 all the way up to $3,100, a 35% jump, technically still stabilized on paper, but functionally almost unrecognizable. The broker involved openly admitted they were trying to max out the number as much as legally possible. Let me put that in terms my own house understands. Freeze a building's income entirely. Let the insurance renewal come in a quarter higher than expected. And the very moment that boiler finally dies, that $100,000 replacement stops being a routine maintenance duty and becomes an actual financial decision, one the landlord might just decide not to make. That's not an oversight in the system. That's the design of the system. What would you actually do if this was your building sitting on the line? Hold that answer, because there's still a date and a number hanging over this entire story, and both of them land before your very next lease renewal. Remember that number I flagged all the way back in the first minute of this video? It has 5 digits. It is not measured in dollars, and it lands before October 1st arrives. According to city data reported by Gothamist, more than 57,000 rent-stabilized apartments across New York sat completely empty as of last spring. These are not condemned buildings. These are not luxury holdouts sitting vacant by choice. These are rent-stabilized homes, the exact category of housing the mayor swore on day one to protect, sitting warehoused and empty, because under the 2019 state rent law, fixing up a single vacant unit often costs more money than the capped rent could ever realistically repay over time. The freeze that entire crowd cheered for in East Harlem doesn't reopen a single one of those 57,000 apartments. If anything, it strips away one more reason any landlord ever would. Now let's walk this entire story back from the beginning, one more time, all the way through. A candidate wins an election on a simple slogan, and then installs a board specifically built to deliver on that slogan. The buildings underneath that promise were already selling for less than their own outstanding mortgages, with $250 million erased in a single January courtroom before anyone even noticed. The bank that understands this sector better than anyone modeled the freeze scenario months in advance and got answered with pizza boxes and a victory speech. The two people inside the system who actually objected, both of them appointed by Democrats, either resigned in protest or simply got outvoted. And through every single step of this, 57,000 supposedly affordable apartments sat completely empty in a city whose own mayor calls this an active housing crisis. For a typical family of 4 living in a stabilized unit, the entire win amounts to about $45 a month. Everyone else in this city is left holding scarcer apartments, thinner maintenance, and a $9 billion loan wall waiting for them in 2027. You walked into this video with just a headline. You're walking out of it with the entire story, which honestly puts you ahead of most of this city right now. There's a lot more of this coming, stories the mainstream headlines never dig into, so make sure you're subscribed before the next one drops. And before you go, drop a comment down below with the number from this video that stopped you cold. I read every single one, and I want to know which detail hit you the hardest.